Ready to
Perfect.
go? All right, so when we're looking at evidence-based now for learning and environments in sport, we always talk about environments and we talk a lot about creating a learning environment, but not a lot of time is often spent on looking at, well, how does that happen or why does it happen? What does the science actually look like behind that? And one of the things that's helped us bridge the gap in this area has been in the area of neuroscience. And neuroscience effectively, without getting bogged down in all the deep genetic side of things, is actually looking at the ability to understand what's happening at a brain level and how does that impact what we see behaviourally, cognitively and emotionally. And so the way we can understand that, or the way we try to explain that for people in sport, which has been a bit of a breakthrough area for us, has been in terms of how the brain actually develops. And so what we know with brain development is it develops from the ground up, and there's effectively three systems that we need to take into account when we're thinking about development and understanding those systems so that we can maximise development and all learning. So we're going to talk about that in terms of numbers. So today we're going to start with system 1, which is effectively the brainstem, just at the base of the skull. What the brainstem's job is to regulate function. In some ways, the survival function. That is, it keeps us breathing, it keeps us swallowing, it keeps our posture right. It does these things without us having to think about it. It's basically it's the extreme safety area of the brain. It's the critical circuitry that if that becomes compromised, we're in some form of trouble. And that's the first part that actually develops. We come into the world with a really strong connection between our body and our brainstem. We're born with a fully functioning brainstem and a slowly developing second system of the brain, which is often referred to as the emotional brain or the limbic area of the brain. And so that is much like a flower that's blooming. We start with a bud that slowly starts to open up. The stem is fully developed. The bud then starts to flourish effectively as we have interaction with our environment, same as the human brain. The emotional brain starts to develop at a rapid speed right from birth. And it doesn't reach full maturity until we're about the age of 25, but the speed in the first 5 years of life is quantum. It becomes really important later on, which we'll come back to, in understanding learning. This area plays a critical role. This limbic system, or the emotional brain as it's sometimes referred to, is the gatekeeper that determines which direction information is transferred. That is, does information need to be transferred back to our safety centre, or does information get put forward into our executive functioning centre or our critical thinking area, which is the third system, or often referred to as the slow brain, which is the prefrontal cortex. And what actually happens at this area of the brain is this is the last part of the flower's development, if you will. This is the part where all the magic happens, if you will, or the CEO's office, as some people refer to it as. It's the ability to think about thinking. So it's our executive control centre. It's the top floor, effectively. It's where all the great decisions happen, and it has the capacity to fundamentally change the functioning of what happens at the other two levels. As we said at the start, the brain develops from the bottom up. The problem we've had with learning in environments in the past in sport is a lot of our processes and a lot of our programs have been set up to work from the top down. That is, they've been highly thinking based, very cognitive, and they haven't taken into account the capacity of the previous two levels and how they can actually interrupt communication with the top executive level. So that is, all information effectively that comes into the environment actually goes through system 2 first. So that is, when I'm walking down the street and I'm coming out along a footpath and I'm walking next to a friend, if all of a sudden I stop and someone's looking at me like, what are you doing? My eyes have taken in information. My emotional brain, or my fast brain, fires first to go, what is that information? Now, it's a brown cylindrical object hanging out of the grass. My immediate response is one of a startled response, and I think, oh, snake. And that is, this fires first. It readies this system for us to have a fight or flight response. If I'm an otherwise well-functioning person, what then happens is communication goes upstairs here, it checks the memory system, says, what do we know about these round cylindrical objects? And we quickly scan around with our eyes and go, hang on, actually, there's a tree there. This may actually just be a branch. It's not moving, it's not hissing, it's not dangerous. The alarm turns off and we can function. We have a laugh together, we've learned something. In situations where I may not be as well functioning, and we'll talk more about this in some depth, when this fires, the response may be so big that what happens is, instead of communication going upstairs, it actually starts to go around on itself, almost like it's being magnetized in a roundabout type fashion. We call this neural looping, and communication to the top floor becomes compromised. And what happens is we have an intense communication between system 2 and system 1. We call this small brain thinking, and it almost looks like a big wheel. When this happens, what we're actually seeing represented in behaviour is a system of survival, or fear-based learning, if you will. That is, the systems are activated that are required to get us to safety, not necessarily to be able to look at how this may be good for our long-term development. All that we're looking at is immediately overcoming the threat. How does that have anything to do with sport, which is so much different to sticks hanging out of the ground in the grass? One way we can look at that is with what we call an integrated model of learning. And this is a three-dimensional model, but today we'll just show you the 2D version. But basically what it looks like is that when I have physical safety, emotional safety, and even some behavioural safety, which we'll chat about, then I have the conditions beginning to be set that allow me to actually be able to function. But it's not the only conditions we need, it's just the precursor. If this becomes compromised at any point in time, this system is activated before we've had a chance to think about anything from a different perspective. If these conditions have been met and I have these safety features in place, there's some other things that I have to have as well for me to be able to function effectively. And one of those is an attachment system. So that is, I have to have relationships with people that allow us to feel as though our needs are being met. That is, they're consistent, they're people that I understand, and I feel like they genuinely care about me, and that they're there for me irrespective of outcome. When we have healthy attachment figures in our life, that combined with safety, we have an opportunity to feel like, hey, I'm not alone in this world. The next condition is we have to have opportunities for control. So we have to have an ability to be able to feel like I've got some say over the direction in which my life is going, or the environment that's in front of me, what's happening in it. I feel like I can actually manually exercise some control over it. And the third condition is I have to have an ability to maximise pleasure and minimise distress. If I feel like what I'm doing is fun, enjoyable and worthwhile pursuit, even if it's difficult, if I actually enjoy it, I feel like I have some control over it, and I feel like the people that I'm engaging with it with, if these conditions are met, then we have the opportunity to achieve well-being, or as the neuroscience literature refers to it as, an integrated self. That is a fully functioning, capacity-driven human. What that means from the original brain drawing that we were looking at before is actually somewhat simpler sometimes than the diagram. That is, the brainstem, the three pillars could be seen as actually the limbic system, or system 2, and the final floor, or the CEO's office, is the integrated self, the ability to think about thinking, to plan, to see how things are relevant for my future. In people that are going well, we're able to have all three conditions met, and we're able to have a full brain activation, a whole brain activation. In environments where these conditions are compromised, so that is, I don't feel safe physically or emotionally, I don't feel like my actions are going to lead me towards safety, I don't feel like the people I'm engaging with, our coaches, our high performance managers, our bosses, I don't feel like I can relate or connect to them, our peers. I don't feel like I have any degree of say in what's happening in my environment. I just have to do what I'm told. And I don't understand how the pursuits I'm engaging in actually connect with what's meaningful to me. They just feel like they're hard and without purpose. Then what happens is I have compromised capacity, or I have a highly activated 1 and 2 system communicating with each other because safety has been breached. And so my capacity to realise my potential as self, or to be able to learn how things could be beneficial for me, my capacity to see things in any other perspective other than how do I survive this, becomes compromised, and therefore what I'm learning is based on fear, as opposed to being able to have our environment create conditions that allows me to learn how things could actually broaden my capacity at this level. If we compromise the first two levels, this level remains untouched, and therefore my question would be, are we ever really actually getting full development? The goal in sport for us should be to actually make environments that are able to do this.